Okay, welcome back everybody for our final panel of the day. Here to moderate, we have Camille Francois, who teaches at Columbia School for International and Public Affairs.
All right, are we getting started? Everybody there? You're with me? Okay. All right, everybody. We have a very exciting panel ahead of us. I'm very honored to be moderating it. We're going to talk about what types of reforms can we imagine to tackle some of the negative impact of algorithmic amplification, filter bubbles. There'll be debate on whether or not they exist, and different types of negative impacts of recommendation. As we dig into these 4 contributions and put them in conversation together, I wanted to sort of share some framing notes. The first one is, it's remarkable to see that all of these contributions take as a point of departure that a lot of the reforms that can be imagined are thinking about the entire system of content moderation. There's definitely a recognition of the role that design is playing. A lot of these interventions are very design focused and acknowledge the limit of traditional conceptions and remedies usually discussed in content moderation. The second thing is there's a lot of references to upcoming regulatory frameworks and regulations in these papers, with a lot of promising thinking around audits, encouraging design code, regulators thinking about how can we shape the design of the platforms on which these amplifications and recommendations are taking shape. And so the conversations we're going to hear, the research and scholarship we're going to discuss is very much also in dialogue with regulatory trends, tendencies. Can we talk about regulatory trends? The regulatory vibes, is that a thing? The third thing that strongly emerges, and we're going to dig into that a bit, is all of these papers that are really focused on imagining new solutions, new design artifacts, new ways to shape these interactions, talk about a shared challenge, and that is the challenge of metrics and measurement. They all struggle with this idea of, it's fantastic to propose new ideas and to build new transparency, new audits, new types of friction, but really there's sort of a joint shared issue emerging around which types of metrics can we rely on to assess the effectiveness, to build transparency regimes on, and to do collective audits around. And finally, I'll say, before we hop into our very first paper, that when the thing that also emerges from these collective conversations is a lot of the types of amplifications and recommendations that we're about to discuss remain very network-based. There's a lot of different ways to do amplifications and recommendations. They're not always network-based. They can be geo-based. They can be content-based. And so a lot of the framing for today is still focused on network-based recommendation systems and interventions. And together we can discuss how to challenge this framing and whether the recommendations and design interventions that are proposed port to other types of platforms and recommendations. So with this, I was speaking a bit to make sure everybody could come in. You're with me? We're awake? We're there? All right. Okay. Let's get into our very first paper. Yes. Luca, you're starting?
Yes.
Okay, let's do it. Do you want to do...
I'll just go here.
Okay. But with a microphone, right?
Yes.
All right. Do you want to start with a brief intro before we hop in?
Sure. Thank you. So thank you, Katie and Arvind, for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you to the Knight First Amendment Institute for hosting. These are not my slides, by the way. I don't know if that's...
No. You can give my talk. That's fine.
Yeah, okay. I don't have slides, just to be clear.
Oh, all right. Do we want to do switcheroo? We're apparently meant to follow the alphabet.
You wanna,
I don't care.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Design intervention.
I do not have slides.
Oh,
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay. Super.
Okay, let's do it again.
Friction at the beginning of every.
Yes, a little bit of friction. Luca, do you feel comfortable engaging in some form of self-bragging, or would you like me to contextualize the room with your bio?
If you would like to contextualize the room, I would appreciate that.
This I can do. Luca, you're the founder and CEO of Sator Labs, and you're University of California Berkeley Tech Policy Fellow. You're a NIST AI visiting fellow, and previously you were the co-founder and research lead for Twitter's machine learning, ethics, transparency, and accountability team, confusingly known as the Meta team. But that's another story. And there you guided industry-leading approaches for responsible machine learning practices and product changes. Before that, you operated a data science and machine learning engineer at Conversant and Wolfram Alpha. Your research interests lie at the intersection of feedback loops, algorithmic amplification with a special eye on politics, and algorithmic audits. You hold a PhD in mathematics from the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and here you are presenting a paper that has been written in a very interesting type of collaboration that we perhaps don't see enough of, because we have two authors on this paper. One is a machine learning computer scientist sort of framing, and you are collaborating with a human rights lawyer to do this paper. So with this, over to you.
Thank you. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, one human rights lawyer and one machine learning researcher walk into a bar. And it's not a joke, it's actually how our collaboration started. So today I'm honored to present the paper, joint work with my wonderful co-author and friend Marlene Wozniak from the European Center for Nonprofit Law. So one of the things that really bothered me around algorithmic amplification discourse, especially when I was at the Bird Factory, was what I call the Schrödinger shadow banning issue. Everyone complains that they're being shadow banned from both sides. And of course, everyone complains that they're being shadow banned in favor for the other side. However, these two things cannot happen at the same time. What I feel is that we are lacking sort of like shared metrics, shared way of understanding what shadow banning means, what algorithmic amplification means. And so this is why we are here today, and we want to be able to offer some suggestion how to measure this phenomenon. So what is algorithmic amplification really? So I would, we argue that it's a very complex reality. It is very difficult to understand what is going on there. It is like trying to figure out the shape of a very complex three-dimensional object just by looking at different projection across different planes. You can imagine a multiverse version of Plato's cave in this case. And so what we are offering, what we are suggesting here is nutrition label as a shadow. Each nutrition label is a different metric to be able to measure algorithmic amplification. And so each of these will give us a little bit of more information about this very complex object that we don't fully understand. Since, as I mentioned, it is indeed a very complex and multidimensional object, we argue that the need for multiple metrics in order to properly understand. However, how many of these metrics, this is an open question and probably cannot be answered at all. So we were inspired by sort of like nutrition label for food. If we look at those, when we buy food at the store, we'll see that have some shared feature. The first one, there is a set of standardized nutrients, for example, proteins, fats, carbs, and whatnot. There is a unit of measure, which is grams for food, and then there is a zero, which is the baseline. And so if we want to properly measure what algorithmic amplification means, we have to define at least each of these. We had very interesting conversation already today, and more to come tomorrow about if a baseline is even possible, what does even mean, and so forth. So our proposal fits in the growing body of work to attach metadata to AI systems. You might be, familiar with data sheets for dataset or model cards that are very popular and recent examples. At the same time, there is an increased policy vibe around regulation vibe around requiring more transparency for AI system and especially recommender system. In particular, in Europe, the Digital Service Act, or DSA, is now law, and it requires, among other things, that recipients of their service are appropriately informed about how recommender system impacts the way information is displayed. So really, there is now a need for companies to come up with ways to disclose or to offer more transparency around their system. And so I want to mention what constraints did we have in mind when we designed this nutrition label. Well, first of all, we want to assess impacts just beyond discrimination only. We also want to keep into consideration freedom of expression, of assembly and association. In general, all the values that are fundamental to a democracy. We also didn't want to require demographic data. A lot of the work we see requires full knowledge of demographic data for users, which is both impractical and also raises a lot of ethical questions about that. These nutrition labels are specific to recommender system, especially in a social media setting, so users can be both producer and consumers, so they're not limited to just classification. And finally, we wanted to offer suggestions that could be implemented in practice rather than be aspirational. And so what are the suggestions at the end of the day? So you can read more in the paper, but very briefly, I'll mention, we propose to look at the top or bottom producers of content measured by impression per piece of content per follower. So you might imagine someone who's a bigger follower might have more impression, and so we want to normalize for that. And the other thing, oftentimes platforms allow you to see content from people you are not explicitly following. And so we argue that if someone's content is mostly shown in out-of-network way, that person is more algorithmic amplified than someone else whose content is shown mostly to their own followers. So these are just two suggestions. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not the end. This is just a starting point. There should be many more metrics. And so the question becomes, who should propose these metrics? And we argue that we need broad input from external stakeholders, especially civic society and marginalized groups. Our hope is this paper would start the conversation and at the same time a call to action to platform and policymakers to design processes for meaningful transparency with collective participation. And again, this is required by law as well. And so I will mention how do we envision them in practice. As I said, will not be a static number. It will evolve over time. It will be multiple numbers, in fact. And so maybe that will be a dashboard with multiple time series. Here we have an interesting challenge it's an interesting tension between offering meaningful information and overwhelming users with information. If we were to track literally every piece of content on every producer on the platform, that will be not helpful at all, because users will be just overwhelmed and it will be impossible to sift through all this information. And so where do we drive this balance? Well, our suggestion would be, from one point of view, to track content or content-based. So it would be interesting to see how content that is labeled as harmful is amplified according to our metrics. And also, oftentimes platform will remove content because it is deemed against their term of service, but this content might be widely shared before it gets removed. And so the question is, how much was this content amplified before its removal? On the other side, we also offer a couple of suggestions for user-based amplification. In general, from a human rights perspective, you don't want to track users. However, we argue that there is an exception to be made for public figures, such as legislators or candidates, or those whose speech can lead to severe human rights risks. And with that, I am...
You're not fully done, because I was given moderator's privilege and the right to ask 2 questions, and I will take them. This is for us to start thinking about where we're going with that. So your dynamic duo, machine learning and human rights, is looking at best practices in the field of responsible AI, applying these transparency models, building on this idea of nutritional labels, and applying this to the amplification of content. And you're proposing in this paper very concrete steps, such as the building of normalized impressions. 2 questions for us before we move on to the next paper. The first one is, you're turning to this comparison of the nutrition labels. That's a very powerful one. You talk a little bit about what makes it easy for people to understand, but you talk also a little bit about the limits of that comparison. Tell us a little bit what works and what doesn't work when we turn to nutrition labels as a metaphor to think through how we want to organize transparency in these systems.
Yeah, great question. So I think in full transparency, there are also limitations in this analogy. For example, when you look at your food nutrition label, you'll see there is a percentage of a sort of like daily recommended amount or whatever. What would be the equivalent of that for our recommended assisted nutrition label? I don't know, and I even don't know if there is an answer to that. Like, what is your daily intake of algorithmic amplification? Is that even... Exactly. And I think maybe the broader problem here is that nutrition labels for food are based on sort of like a very, very long scholarship in science about, food science. I think we all agree that, vegetables, in general, scientists agree that, vegetables are good for you, that you should not eat too much sugar and things like that. We do lack this sort of, maybe a body which will be the equivalent of the FDA in the US and similar bodies in everywhere else, but like we do lack sort of the centralized authority that could make these suggestions. I feel like, this science is still very new. We have eaten food since the dawn of time, but recommender system or algorithmic amplification is something that is way more recent.
Great. Second question. You talk about how that proposal is really to be co-built with civil society, and how important is it to engage, co-create with marginalized groups. This we know, marginalized group isn't the bulk of the employees of Silicon Valley, and so the question becomes, does this become possible outside of the walls of these corporations? Can this be done in a participatory audit type of way? Can this be co-created perhaps even in an adversarial manner with groups who are able to probe the system from the outside and together collaborate on these nutrition labels?
I think so. I hope so.
So that's a call for help.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. 2 people can definitely not define that for everyone else. And especially, as we mentioned earlier, that, for example, the DSA in Europe is mandating audits. That could be a place where these things could be developed and suggested, even in an adversarial way. If we're waiting for consensus to include marginalized group, then that will probably never happen. So, yeah, I feel strongly that there are these things do not have to necessarily be developed inside the company. If anything, the opposite.
All right. Thank you so much. We will pick this up in discussion. All right. So the Knight Institute is playing a weird trick on me. A long time ago, I wrote a paper called the ABC Framework. I think we're trying to figure out if I know the rest of the alphabet. The answer is definitely no. So I think, where are we going next? F. We're going F. All right. This makes a lot of sense. Right. Over to you.
Am I up? I'm up.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Knight. Thank all of you.
I need to hype you up before you do that.
What?
I need to hype you up before you do that.
Time. I only got 10 minutes.
Are
I'm
you
already
sure?
losing it. I got
all right,
exactly
great.
10 minutes, 15 seconds to talk to give. I don't even want to waste it now. It's already ticking.
Okay, well, but then you
I'm
have
Brett
to say where
Frischmann.
you're coming
You can find
from.
my bio in places. I'll talk to you later.
Page
Wanna know me? Talk to
37
me
in
at
the
break.
booklet.
All right, so I'm going to
All
make a
right.
pitch. I'm jumping in. Sorry.
Jump in. Page
All right.
37 if you're with us. Jump in.
So digital network society needs friction in design, and in some cases, friction in design regulation that targets digital architectures, supposedly smart algorithmic systems, and interfaces that shape human interactions and behavior. The relentless push to eliminate friction in the digital networked environment for the sake of efficiency has had hidden social costs that affect basic human capabilities and society. And so the conference title asked the question, optimizing for what? And I think the answer for Paul Ohm, my co-author, and I, to that question would be human flourishing, maybe measured by the capabilities approach. But for that to happen, for a general course correction is needed. So we ask a prior question, amplifying of what? And we want to urge that the researchers at this conference and in this emerging field keep their focus not only on speech and content that gets posted, shared, reshared, algorithmically amplified among users and so on, but also on how amplification directly impacts other activities, behaviors, and conduct, as well as other types of public and social goods that are not easily reducible to speech, though they're related, things like data, knowledge, social capital, affiliations, trust, privacy, and security, just to name a few. So at the outset, I would emphasize that what's being optimized and even amplified are patterns of engineered behavior, and that moderation, mediation, and amplification of speech or content flows are an integral part of a complex technosocial system. So social media platforms, there we go. This is just saved me so I have to run through it. Social media platforms are a prime example. While platforms certainly vary in form, function, scale, scope, and architectural design, most of them share these 5 components. It's tempting, analytically, to lump all of these component systems together, attach the platform label, and then talk about the platform as a monolith, sometimes as a black box, or maybe we just call it the algorithm. Alternatively, we might focus exclusively on 1 or 2 of the components, put aside the others, and there are decent reasons for both of those approaches. So for example, a focus on speech might prioritize the second component system, the mechanisms for processing, curating, distributing, amplifying, or prioritizing speech. While Paul and I agree that which and whose messages get more or less amplification and attention, how and by whom, are incredibly important questions, we take a third approach, which is to examine the whole while directing attention to the seams, by which I mean the boundaries, the borders, and the interfaces, and the interdependencies among component systems and with external systems and agents. So there are many interdependent design decisions relevant to evaluating amplification, prioritization, and optimization, and many of those decisions present opportunities for friction in design measures. Of course, there are also, and this came out in a bunch of the talks today, there are also many interdependent values at stake, some of which are incommensurable, but nonetheless, many, including many non-speech values. And so how to prioritize them is hotly contested, which I think presents a genuine challenge for the very idea of optimization, at least in computational systems. In prior work, we examined the economic, social, and political logics that have driven and continue to drive the development, design, and deployment of digital network technologies, including social media platforms and supposedly smart devices and AI systems. The logics fetishize computational power, aim to implement and extend a Taylorist ideal of scientific, or today we would call it data-driven, management of human beings, and embrace the optimization of technosocial systems in service of efficiency, productivity, and a rather thin conception of manufactured happiness. It's a complicated story to tell. It's the subject of my 2018 book. But for our purposes, the logics support a few simple design mantras that should be familiar to anyone in law, economics, engineering, or computer science. And to save myself time, I listed those. Each of these is superficially defensible, and yet they're deeply flawed upon examination or when applied across a social system. Human beings are necessarily inefficient. We need friction in our lives. Seams are critical to governance. We need boundaries for ourselves and our communities. Interconnection should often be seam-full, as that friction can have as that friction can provide the opportunity or space for learning and for governance. Growth in scale and scope is often overrated, as it can have hidden substantial trade-offs, usually involving externalities. Democratize, like the word innovation, has become a useless buzzword. that hides considerations of power, quality, and meaning, among other things. So our basic, if somewhat counterintuitive, claim is that society needs to deliberately engineer friction into and between rather than out of various technosocial systems. It turns out that friction in design is actually quite common offline. It works rather well in serving instrumental societal needs. A familiar example, though by no means the only example, is the speed bump. So speed bumps are architectural features of a road deliberately designed to introduce friction that triggers consideration of anticipated costs, or future costs, for the functional purpose of inducing behavioral change, that is speed moderation, and in service of the social ends of safety and public order. So as with all friction in design measures, there will be trade-offs. And so with another one of our co-authors, Susan Benish, who's also a human rights lawyer, we develop and apply a framework for designing, evaluating, and comparing friction in design measures both offline and online. So here's a familiar example, probably for everyone in the room. You're a human, not a bot. CAPTCHA, right? So CAPTCHAs support a type of friction in design measure, which we call in another paper governance seams. Basically, CAPTCHAs govern behavior at an important interface. That's the relevant seam. They create friction with a functional purpose, that is authentication, and they enable governance in the enforcement of a membership rule, that is humans allowed, bots not. Now, it might seem a few steps removed from amplification conversations, but consider for just a second how enforcing this rule shapes speech and the tools for amplification. Consider another example. And by the way, this is to illustrate to some degree the descriptive framework, the kinds of parameters of friction design measures that we want to perhaps study. Another example is the forwarding restriction implemented by WhatsApp. So as a countermeasure to frictionless forwarding of messages, which led to viral information, heinous lynchings, and serious harms offline, the company added friction in design measures that restricted forwarding of messages that had already been forwarded many times. So the friction takes the form of a delay, extra steps, and effort in order to reach a larger audience. It applies to all messages, and it's content neutral. So it might be useful to even abstract from the WhatsApp measure so we can learn something. Consider the basic design of any communication system, right? Forwarding functionality is not a given. Rather, it's a possible design feature. The case for offering this capability depends on the type of platform, the content, anticipated communications. Obviously, forwarding emails is quite different from forwarding text messages or social media posts. One might frame this as a kind of binary choice about whether or not to enable forwarding. Users might even experience the technology this way. Designers might be predisposed to follow the design imperatives, aiming to minimize transaction costs, eliminate friction, remove seams, and even democratize speech. But one of our goals is to remind designers and users and possibly regulators that it's not a binary choice, that the dominant design imperatives are fundamentally flawed and need to be replaced, and so it's worth evaluating how much and what types of friction a designer could and should choose. Frankly, the introduction of any new capability might present this seemingly abrupt all-or-nothing change. Prior to Facebook enabling sharing or one-click affirmation by liking, the action was not possible directly via the platform, on the platform. Of course, alternative means for accomplishing similar ends were possible. You could always pull a post off the platform and send it by email, right? But the off-platform option would entail substantial transaction costs and friction and limited scale and scope. Adding the on-platform capability eliminates those costs and friction and expands the scale and scope and reach. So one constant design question when introducing something new ought to be whether and how to use friction in design, whether to create a governance seam, to set expectations and norms, to slow things down, to scaffold affordances necessary for meaningful engagement, and so on and so forth. So in closing, let me highlight 3 examples of platform design features. I think I got a slide on this. Yep. The optimized to engineer patterns of behavior, which we call Orwellian engagement because it's so shallow and superficial. First, the continuous or infinite scrolling, a way to maximize time spent on an app. Standard design feature that loads new content as a user approaches the bottom of a screen, right, or the end of a video, so the user does not have to wait for more, nor stop and think about whether or not they want to leave or proceed, right? It eliminates what would otherwise be a seam for self-governance. Second, you can think about superficial communication scripts, affirmation by one-click buttons of whatever kind, right? Standard design feature that makes a particular kind or style of engagement frictionless. It also makes collection of data about user preferences frictionless too. It's frictionless surveillance. The design feature shapes the style and content of user communications as users cater to anticipated demands of weak ties and non-ties or strangers. Third, and finally, many social media platforms moderate feeds for users. This has been the topic of many of the papers at this conference, so today and tomorrow. Essentially prioritizing the order in which posts, advertising, and other content are presented or not. While it's difficult to generalize about the moderation, and I'm not going to try to do so, one thing I can say, I think pretty confidently based on everything that everyone said over the last day and a half, is that the objective function remains more or less the same. That's the problem. An incredible variety of friction and design measures could be introduced to encourage meaningful engagement and discourage superficial engagement, to enable self and community governance, to support cultivation of trustworthy relationships, to dampen virality or more broadly constrain the scale and scope of digital communications among absolute strangers. The primary impetus of this talk and our essay is to reveal an underappreciated territory we hope to explore systematically, hopefully in collaboration with many of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay with me for one question. This was a formidable paper. One of the things that I learned through it that I encourage you to pick up the paper for is the bizarre actual full name of a CAPTCHA, what it actually means. But beyond, oh, well, read the paper, or worst comes to worst, ask ChatGPT, but get to it. It's a fun one. Thank you for making us question whether we do want seamless online interactions or whether we want them to be seamful. One question before we move on to the rest of the paper is to sort of continue building on that discussion is a lot of the examples that you give in the paper and in the framework are about friction that have been built by the platforms themselves, by the websites on which they're deployed. That's the case for the forwarding on WhatsApp. That's, of course, the case for the CAPTCHAs. What do you think about this framework that you're building and this seamful connections and interactions and frictions that you're calling for made by users for other users? In other terms, do you believe in what people have sometimes called middleware or in the ability to add a layer of friction on top of a platform without the platform being the designer of that friction itself?
Absolutely. As I said, I think in like 3 of the talks yesterday to people, that what platforms are doing is absolutely worth studying because it gives a sense of something that's possible, but we should never limit what we're thinking about or trying to design or testing and our experiments to what they're doing. We should be thinking what could be done and what should be done, and so we should expand the horizon. Absolutely think that the middleware stuff that we've been talking about, with Tarleton and I were talking about this at the break, Daphne and I were talking about it as well, absolutely believe in it. I think and actually to get a middleware solution for lots of these problems, you need to build a governance scene, and maybe an antitrust-driven governance scene that enables through APIs. So APIs are another site of governance. How they're designed enables governance by the platforms or by a service provider, but you can also have them designed otherwise. The government can mandate APIs be open in certain ways in order to regulate or govern indirectly. So absolutely, yes.
All right, thank you. See what we're doing here? There's like all these great reforms. There's a one track where platforms do it. There's another track where the participatory audits are done in an adversarial way, and all this is done by middleware. We're going to try to see if we can find our way through. All right, third talk. Let's do this. Ravi, you're okay with my doing a little bit of hyping?
Sure.
Thank you. All right. Ravi, you are the managing director of the Psychology of Technology Institute, which is a part of the University of Southern California's Neely Center. Before that, you led data science, research, and product teams across Facebook towards improving the societal impact of social media. You helped co-found and build the initial algorithms for Ranker.com, which is a profitable publisher of crowdsourced lists. You have a PhD in social psychology from the University of Southern California, and you have co-authored dozens of highly cited empirical articles about polarization technology. You've worked with numerous nonprofits in fighting polarization, and today you're talking to us about the algorithmic management of polarization and violence on social media.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here, for your attention. This is work I've been doing with Jonathan Stray, who's here in the audience today from UC Berkeley's Center for Human Compatible AI, as well as Helena Puig-Larawi, who manages a peace-building organization called Build Up. So clearly, social media is important to conflict. So it's been implicated in human rights violations in Myanmar. It's where we learn about the war in Ukraine. It's where misinformation about Ukraine spreads. It's implicated in the January 6th protests that led to violence in our country, but it's also been implicated in the downfall of authoritarian governments around the world. So clearly social media is important to conflict, but conflict isn't necessarily always bad. And so one thing we do that was really heartening in this collaboration was going through the conflict literature, which I was not as aware of before, and understanding the difference between what people think of as more destructive forms of conflict and what people think of as more constructive forms of conflict. And so constructive forms of conflict are when we argue about issues often. It's important in society for us to be able to talk about the issues that we disagree with, and it's an important part of democracy to resolve those issues. Destructive conflict is when that conflict starts to become more about identity, it starts to become affective in nature, and it starts to become more intractable. And destructive conflict is the kind of conflict that often will more likely lead to polarization and to violence. And importantly, these conflict cycles begin long before violence occurs. So you can't wait to think about social media's relation to violence when violence is imminent. You need to think about it long beforehand. And in the paper, we argue that social media facilitates destructive conflict in two ways. And the first way is that the open, frictionless design, sort of echoing Brett's talk, enables mass harassment and manipulation. There have always been people in society who want to engage in more destructive forms of conflict, and it makes their jobs easier that we have platforms that enable them to reach anyone they want to all the time. And without the friction that occurs in society, the negative feedback that you get when you lie to people, the need to build a reputation to reach lots of groups of people. And so what you see are these actors often using things like disinformation for hire, troll armies, and the frictionless design has sort of enabled destructive conflict actors to do their work better. But it doesn't just stop there. Social media also incentivizes people who would otherwise be more moderate and otherwise not participate in destructive conflict towards creating more polarizing content. And we cite three forms of evidence for this in our paper. One are the statements of the publishers and politicians themselves. So, and I think this is a little more than anecdote because the publishers and politicians who say to talk about their incentives often have sophisticated software that tells them what does better or what does worse. And so here's a quote from Ben Sass from his book, Them, and he talks about how he interviews some celebrities who try to escape from the outrage of the day coverage, but what happens is nobody clicks, their metrics plummet, and they throw themselves back into the outrage loop. And so this is something that BuzzFeed has said, other politicians have said, that they are incentivized to produce more polarizing content. Those experiences dovetail well with some of the A/B test experiment data that has recently become public. So there's a recent Wall Street Journal article about Facebook for political content removing the optimization for comments and share predictions from their ranking models. And as a result, users told Facebook that their feeds were actually more worth their time. Anger reactions fell by more than a half, and you saw less bullying, less misinformation, and less graphic violence. And so this is one of several platform experiments that we have access to. And it'd be wonderful if we get access to all of the platform experiments. But these are just several platform experiments that have become public that sort of dovetail with the experiences that publishers are saying that there is this incentive towards more divisive content. And then finally, there's evidence from labs that study social media. And actually, Smith's study is probably one of the best examples I've seen of this that was presented earlier today, where people observe that the content that gets the most engagement on social media is the content that is often negative and about the outgroup. And so if we are optimizing for engagement and this kind of content is getting the most engagement, it is unsurprising that publishers experience this incentive towards more divisive content. So traditionally, addressing social media's relationship to polarization and violence might be dealt with content moderation. But I'd love to use the example of fear speech as an example of why content moderation is a limited solution for these problems. So fear speech, a good example of it is, you might remember around the George Floyd protests, there was content on social media suggesting that members of Antifa were part of the protests and they were something that you needed to defend your community against. And some people in the community took it upon themselves to arm themselves, go to the protests, and some people were shot. This kind of fear speech, there's a paper in PNAS recently that was published. This kind of fear speech is often more common and more problematic than hate speech, which is something that content moderation often deals with. It is also a kind of speech that often leads to hate and animosity between groups, just like hate speech. But if you actually rely on content moderation to restrict fear speech, you'll often run into problems of over-enforcement and calls of censorship. And this is in part because fear speech is not necessarily inherently bad. There are things that fear exists for adaptive reasons, and there are reasons for us to be afraid of some things in society. And so if you're on one side or the other side of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, or you're in Ukraine, and do you really want a social media company telling you what you can or cannot say that you're afraid of? I think those kinds of judgments are problematic for a company to make without leading to over-enforcement and censorship. So what we argue for in the paper is not relying on content moderation of speech, but rather relying on design to address social media's impact on conflict and violence. And so the analogy I sometimes use is to building codes. We don't let builders decide for themselves how they're going to build buildings to be safer, right? We give them clear guidelines about what is safer building design. And similarly, we feel that it would be great to give technology companies clear guidelines for what it is to build a safer building. We also don't hold builders responsible when bad things happen in their building. We hold them responsible if they design a building that incentivizes negative things, right? That is actually more flammable. Just as social media companies didn't create all the conflict in the world, there will always be some destructive conflict on their platforms. But we can ask the question, are they incentivizing that destructive conflict? And we think there are some design choices they could make that would actually support the transformation from destructive conflict to more constructive conflict. And so here in the paper, we talk about 7 specific ideas. One of them is implicated in some of the data I just showed you. Removing the optimization for comments, shares, and time spent, especially in sensitive contexts. The interesting thing about these kinds of engagement is that they're value neutral. Like, we've all commented on something that we hate. Right? We've all shared something and said, like, look at this terrible thing. We've all spent time with something that we actually didn't really enjoy. And so if you replace those signals with signals of things that people actually want, that are signals of things that people actually want, for example, a love reaction. It's unlikely you're love reacting to something that you actually didn't enjoy. You actually get better results for conflict outcomes. One of the bridge building professionals that we've talked with actually suggests creating a user interface element for bridge builders to suggest content that was bridging, that was actually helping people bridge divisions. You can imagine that was an informative button, that was a clarifying button. You can imagine user interfaces that would allow people to indicate content that was more positive for both users and society, and using those kinds of engagement signals in place of things like comments, shares, and time spent. Similar to some of the ideas that we've spoken about before, we also talk about adding more friction to systems, allowing for negative signals. So what stops people in the offline world from lying to others? There's some amount of negative feedback that they get, right? Online systems often lack that negative feedback. There's also a desire to protect your reputation. Online systems often lack the ability for the requirement that people build a level of trust and reputation before they can reach large groups of other people. So introducing some of those elements of friction would be adaptive for conflict outcomes. Also providing accessible privacy controls for users. And then one forward-thinking idea is the idea of using automated spell checks or automated systems like ChatGPT to help suggest to people ways that they could reframe the messages they're sending to be more constructive. And finally, the last thing we talk about is the need for metrics. And the line that we talk about in the paper is that in a world where it's really easy to measure engagement and it's really hard to measure societal outcome, what you'll often see is that even the most well-meaning of companies will end up optimizing for engagement. And so we as a society can make it easier for companies to understand when they're moving in the right direction. We could build public metrics to understand if, for example, TikTok becomes more polarizing. And so there are some discussion of survey metrics that potentially could be used in that way that we talk about in the paper. So that is my talk. Again, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take a question.
Thank you, Ravi. That's an invitation to come and build a building code for platforms with you and with public metrics to 100%. Be used to hold people accountable. Also an invitation to use large language models next time you want to write something nasty on the internet, right? All right, we are slower than what I expected, which is probably my fault. And so we will transition to our last talk before putting you all in conversation about these papers. So Yoel, I think you are up next, and while you You want to stay here? You
I'm
don't want to
extremely clumsy, and the aisle here is very tight, so I feel like I don't want to
So why don't you make
face plant, so
yourself
I'm just gonna-
comfortable while I hype you up? All right. Yoel, you're a technology policy fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and you're the former head of trust and safety at Twitter. For more than 7 years, you led the team responsible for Twitter's content moderation, integrity, platform security efforts, and this includes policy development, threat investigation, product, design, research, and operations.
You can just say censorship, it's fine.
No, we're going to list them all out, and that really matters because we're going to talk about where all of these interventions live. Do they live in operations? Do they live in design? Do they live in product? Do they live in policy? That range matters. So we will list painfully all of them. Your current research and writing focuses on the trust and safety industry and how technology companies manage the conflicting values and incentives built into content moderation at scale. Before joining Twitter, you received your PhD from the Annenberg School for Communications at UPenn. And now, over to you to bring us some, perhaps, a little bit of a big tech perspective on all of the issues that we have been discussing. Dr. Roth, I can see your graying academic hair, but if you want to reach into your bag and put a little bit of a big tech hat on for a hot second, you can maybe help us contextualize how do those design interventions live from a platform's perspective.
Awesome. I wish I could give my former academic life credit for my gray hair, but that one goes to Elon Musk. So since leaving my job at Twitter, I have been fortunate to be able to lead a research project looking at Mastodon and federated platforms and how we do trust and safety work on Mastodon. And usually when I talk to people about Mastodon, the reaction is kind of like, being the last panel of the day at a conference, everybody gets like a little bit sleepy and waits to go do something else. And when I ask them, well, why are you not interested in Mastodon? Usually the answer is, it's too confusing. I don't get it. Signing up is really hard. It's really annoying. Can somebody just build a different version of Twitter? And in the context of the discussions we're having today, that really got me thinking about what do we need to do to build interventions that are going to be effective in the real world and not just in a laboratory. And so today I want to talk a little bit about design and make the case for thinking about UX design as a core part of our research agenda and a core part of what we're building. When he was talking about the development of the iPod, Steve Jobs famously said that design is how it works. It's not just aesthetics, it's not just the color of the button or where it's positioned, it's about the overall user experience. And so in this context, I'm going to offer a slight elaboration on what Steve Jobs was talking about and say that when we're building these interventions, we need to think very critically about design and how it operates in the real world, particularly when it comes to interventions into algorithmic amplification, privacy, and a whole host of other trust and safety challenges. The good news is, a lot of the really provocative and generative ideas discussed in this panel have antecedents that have been tested in the real world. And so I'm going to talk a bit about those, perhaps pour a little bit of cold water on some of the optimism we've developed over the course of the day, but then talk about where we go from here. And so let's start with nutrition labels. Famously, a couple of years ago, Apple introduced the concept of privacy nutrition labels as a requirement that they place on developers shipping apps in the App Store on iOS devices and Macs. These were touted as being an incredible step forward for user education and transparency. They were positioned as part of Apple's overall marketing strategy to tout privacy as what the iPhone is for, another reason for you to spend thousands of dollars with the company. And were also then touted as being a meaningful step towards educating consumers about how their data circulates and is used. That all sounds great. Let's give the nutrition labels a bit of a report card. They were mandated by Apple as part of their developer policies. But even with that mandate, they generally are still not all that prevalent. As of 2021, a year after their introduction, only about 50% of apps available in the App Store had even been updated to include the nutrition labels. More recently, Apple has started purging old apps that didn't have the labels, so they're lighting a bit of a fire under developers, but turns out wasn't super widely adopted, even with the threat of a penalty from Apple on the table. Next, let's turn to accuracy. Can you trust the nutrition labels that you're seeing in the product? In brief, no. A 2022 study found that even of apps with up-to-date nutrition labels that developers had recently changed, 16% of them sent data to third parties, significant user data to third parties, despite claiming that they did no such thing. So that's kind of a bummer. It's like if you go in and look at the nutrition label on a piece of food and it claims that it contains no carbohydrates, but you're actually eating a loaf of bread, doesn't really work. There are particular gaps here around some of the more complex types of data, and in fact, the things that are most sensitive to consumers. Things like what counts as user identifiable, things that people in this room know an awful lot about and can talk at length about, but it turns out they don't distill well into the format of a nutrition label that appears in the App Store. Finally, and this is my favorite bit, the author of the study actually interviewed developers about their experience creating these nutrition labels. And echoing some of my own findings from back in 2012 when I talked to developers about interpreting Apple's App Store guidelines, the finding was that developers were almost universally stumped about how the hell to comply with Apple's policies. It turns out Apple gave them a mandate and a framework and a set of APIs, and then left it to every mom and pop developer to figure out how to make attestations about their privacy and data management practices, which, as we've already said, didn't work particularly well. But let's talk about how it works on the consumer side. Do these labels actually work for consumers? And the answer, again, is probably not. Studies in 2022 have found generally low awareness of the existence of privacy labels outside of expert audiences. So, spoiler alert, if you are in this room, you probably know a lot more about the existence of privacy and nutrition labels than most consumers ever will, and you should see yourself not as a representative sample of consumers. Second, people cited challenges with the interpretability of these labels. It turns out even a well-designed, Apple-crafted, meticulous Johnny Ive intervention is completely inscrutable to most people. So nobody actually understands what it is they're seeing when they're in the App Store. Third, you run into real challenges around interpretability across different platforms and across different types of apps. Apps are collecting different data for different purposes. iOS and Android have different APIs for governing user information. And all of this makes it an extremely messy, murky terrain for consumers to try to navigate. And consequently, they have absolutely no idea what the hell is going on. But do these labels do important work? And this is where I will go against my nature and be slightly glass half full and say yes. And the reason that nutrition labels really matter is that they prompt developers and companies to think critically about their privacy practices, because for the first time ever, they have to. There is now a regulatory regime, admittedly regulation by Apple, not by governments, but there is a regulatory regime that is compelling companies to think critically about how they collect data and how they use it so that they can disclose it to their users. And developers have said that actually going through that process of thinking about it, of being intentional about design, was incredibly beneficial for them and resulted in them making better choices about data management. So a little bit of a mixed record when it comes to nutrition labels, but there's still promise in some of these interventions. Let's talk about user-facing interventions as well, because they've come up a number of times today. In the first session this morning, Tomo mentioned a change to the Twitter product, actually, that I had the privilege to be a part of, which was launching Twitter's first ranked timeline. For those of you who maybe have forgotten that episode in Twitter history, Twitter used to be purely reverse chronological, and then in a moment, which people chronicled with the hashtag RIP Twitter, we did our level best to kill the app that everybody loves by changing the home timeline from being reverse chronological to algorithmically ranked. Now, when we first launched this, I was leading the company's trust and safety efforts for that product, and my engineering counterpart was a guy named Parag, who later became the CEO of the entire company. So clearly he made better choices. But interestingly, back then we had a lot of conversations about user controls, and we in fact introduced a setting. I was really proud of the fact that when we launched an algorithmic home timeline, there was a one-tap toggle to turn it off. We introduced this toggle over the objections of some people on the product team because it turns out it was incredibly beneficial for Twitter's growth metrics to have an algorithmically ranked home timeline. People used the app more, they engaged more, they shared more, they spent more time in the app, and it ultimately drove user growth to have an algorithm rather than a purely reverse chronological timeline. But we felt that it was still the right trade-off to offer them that control, in large part because the overwhelming majority of people never used it. So we built a setting and we patted ourselves on the back for it, and then nobody bothered to use our setting, and so Twitter got all of the benefits of growth while still being able to publish really nice press releases saying that we supported algorithmic control. So yay for us. We saw similar dynamics when we introduced a safe search product. Safe search on Twitter is a filtered version of safe that largely removes pornography and adult content, but also has some stricter filters around things like abusive content. For the first 3 months after Twitter launched this feature, 99% of people, in fact, over 99% of people, never bothered to touch it. More than a year later, I went back and checked the data. 95% of people had never touched it. And so what we're finding here is not a novel insight, but it's an important one, which is even when you give people controls, even when they are well-designed, thoughtful controls, the vast majority of folks are never going to touch them and are never going to bother changing those settings from the defaults. And so when we talk about what we should be building, what controls we want to offer people, the different levers that we give folks to tune their experience, that's the right first step. And then the next step is, what are the defaults? And do the defaults make sense? And are they well-designed and well-researched? Because in most cases, you're not actually going to see consumers actively engaging with all of the options that even well-meaning platforms give them. So let's talk about what works here. I've signaled at this a little bit, but let me state it up front and directly. First, put these interventions in people's faces. There's a lot of evidence that the more overt you make interventions into harmful content and conduct online, the more effective they are. At Twitter, we introduced a feature called nudges, which was designed to discourage people from engaging in abusive or toxic conduct. And what Twitter's researchers found was that they were remarkably effective. They're these like slightly cringy notices that show up if you're saying something mean to somebody, but it turns out when presented with the cringy notice, 30% of people either abandoned their tweet or changed it to make it less abusive. That's kind of a remarkable effect in any study, and we were seeing this in the real world in our product, where usually effectiveness changes are measured in fractions of percents. We saw 30% effectiveness. That's really significant. We saw similar effects when we introduced very overt interventions on state-controlled media outlets. Again, we saw a 30% decrease in the reach and spread of state media when Twitter made not only labels very visible in the product, but also added those same types of nudges. And so either all of our studies return 30% effectiveness because there's a giant bug in Twitter's research pipeline, or it turns out these overt interventions are incredibly effective. And so I'll make the case first for not just building these features, but thinking about ways that we can make them as overt and seamlessly integrated into the user experience as possible. A tall order, but no doubt something that we can achieve. Finally, I want us to think really carefully about the need for sensible defaults. About a week ago, the emergent Twitter competitor Blue Sky made headlines for talking about what they call composable moderation. It's this idea that content moderation is not a single thing that a company does, but rather a set of different filters that people can configure. And there's been a lot of reasonable criticism of this approach, saying, should we really have a toggle that lets people turn on violent extremism? And I think that's a reasonable question to ask. But I would go further and say, if the default is that violent extremism is off and the vast majority of people are never going to change it, do we get enough bang for our buck? The answer, I'm sure, is no, it's not that simple, because actually enabling violent extremists to organize online is dangerous, even if 99% of people never see it. But we need to think about the role that defaults play and think about them as a key site of intervention. And so I'll close just by saying, I think this is an open research question and one that requires a higher degree of collaboration between the folks in this room and the folks at the platforms themselves. And so it's hard, especially now, especially as Silicon Valley is going through wave after wave of layoffs, to find somebody at one of these companies to even talk to. But it's important that we think not just about what are things that are effective in a lab, what is something that works in an academic study, but that we test these concepts in reality and with an eye towards effective user experience design. With that, I will close and turn it back over to Cam.
Thank you, Yoel. We had some very nice background jazz that started very sad when you talked about the fact that nobody understands or really wants to do nutrition labels, but that kind of lightened up the mood when we talked about how default settings actually can make a meaningful impact. C is coming with us. We're going to enter solutions territory, thinking about interventions that are very much in user space, thinking about default. So before we turn on to internet questions and room questions, which I have nicely displayed on an iPad here, I want to turn it back over to the four of you for any questions you want to ask one another or anything you want to build on each other's intervention. You don't have to be shy.
I mean, I'll just echo what Yoel said. So my experience at a platform is consistent with the idea that oftentimes you try something and you try it badly, and then you decide that like that was a terrible idea, when if you just tried it better, it might have been a good idea. So like a lot of these things that he talked about are good ideas. If you just don't put them in the defaults or make them very prominent for users, they don't actually work. And so I just encourage people who are trying these solutions not to give up when the first iteration of your solution doesn't work.
The jazz band in the background was really excited about that.
Yeah. This is very exciting. Let's share some research. Let's get some data out of these platforms to make sure that the solutions we discard actually might have just been poorly implemented.
So I guess I'll throw in that maybe it's a question for Yoel, but I 100% agree that the emphasis on defaults is super important to evaluating any of the interventions. And I'm just wondering, what are the things in the sort of nudging social engineering literature is sort of choosing a default versus sort of an active choosing option where you don't in fact set any defaults, but you force users, which is probably the most overt form of intervention. And I just wonder if that was something that you'd had in mind when you were sort of raising that issue.
Yeah.
Looks
no,
like it, 'cause you're
I think
nodding.
I am nodding enthusiastically. Look, there's a tension here, right? Like, bring that pitch to anybody working on growth at a social media company, and they will talk to you in mind-numbing detail about the top of funnel and how you need to maximize your conversion rate from first sign-up into usage of your... And it's just sort of like the same story for how companies end up in bad places because they're trying to reduce the amount of friction between you and an advertisement that they want to show you on the service. So that's the issue in reality. But I think ultimately making those kinds of decisions a core part of the user experience and making them feel native and helpful is the path forward. Perhaps it doesn't all need to happen on sign up, but I think there are ways that you can contextually prompt people to revisit their settings, to think about them. I think Facebook do a good job with this with their privacy checkup, to give credit where it is due. And I think those types of sort of not artificial, you don't have to go digging in your settings, but it is an in situ recommendation to think about this thing, are some of the most promising treatments for getting people to be more aware of and engaged with some of these settings.
I have a provocation for the four of you, but building on what you said, you're saying it's unlikely that it comes to all of the users first because this isn't how tech companies work. There is, however, a group of users specifically for which there's a lot of pressure to change the default settings, to change the default experience, and those are kids. And today, with a lot of regulations and regulatory frameworks that are focused on kids, age-appropriate design codes, how we change the platforms and the default settings and the experience for kids, are we going to see perhaps those changes and positive changes, new options, new defaults for kids first? Is that actually pushing in the right direction? Is the jazz enthusiastically upbeat? Or is it going to be nightmare for kids and different nightmares for adults?
Yeah, I mean, the jazz really is remarkable. You think about things that might go wrong during talks, and this was nowhere on my list. No, I mean, I think some of the challenges with the hyper age-focused design codes and regulatory approaches is that they are hyper-focused on age. I think everybody deserves more robust options to think about privacy and safety. Everybody deserves the ability to be private before they intentionally become public and to have that be an active decision rather than a default. I would like to see that go further. I think it makes sense to start with what seems the most overtly harmful, which is endangering children, but go further than that. Go even bolder, I say.
Yeah,
as the music swells.
Yeah.
I mean, I just echo that a lot of things that I have seen adopted by platforms in a steady state start with the most acute or the most crisis case. And so a lot of times, yes, all people deserve some of these better experiences, but certainly the fact that we're starting with the most acute case, the most important case, is not unsurprising, and I could see it eventually migrating to something that is accessible for everyone.
And I mean, to be honest, it's like it would be lovely to see function creep work to our advantage, as opposed to seeing surveillance creep. It tends to work in the opposite direction. So yeah.
Luca.
Can I respond to something you all said earlier?
I was going to say, someone's got to stand up for those nutrition labels too.
Exactly.
Yeah, let's
I
do
think
it.
Personally, no, I'm kidding. What you said about sort of like the average user will not look into them is absolutely true. I also think that the people who are going to look into this kind of labels, this kind of things, are going to be the people who are going to make the most trouble for companies. You can think policymaker, journalists, activists. So maybe I would argue that these will be useful for society at large, but not because each person will actively look at them, but because, troublemakers in a positive way will be empowered to look into that and see if something's happening. But in general, point well taken that none of us here is probably the sort of like average user of any tech platform.
I have to share with you the question that emerges from many questions. I'm going to do my best large language model impression, but at least 4 questions are really asking the same thing, some of them phrased in more brutal ways than other. One of them, essentially the question is like, what does it take for platforms to actually do any of that? That's sort of the overall theme. Somebody says, trust and safety, lovely concept, but this is going to be really brutal. Those teams are not well funded, they're not well staffed, they're not prioritized, and they're generally a cost center, which is very brutal. Somebody else says, how many of the changes that have been implemented have been disclosed in any meaningful transparency or even have been exposed to users? Well, you talked a little bit about that. And someone says, like, how do you actually incentivize those platforms to integrate friction or to do any meaningful steps towards the interventions that you'll propose? So let's talk about this. What does it take? Is it arm twisting? Is it, let's start with kids? Is this regulation? How do you go about making platforms sort of hop on this train? No more jazz. That's on you. That's on you guys. Let's just do it.
I mean, one reason I come to things like this is that I think platforms exploit the divisions we have in society about what to do. And the more we can come together as a group and decide, these are the metrics we care about, these are the interventions we need, these are the design affordances that we actually want to do. When you keep in the realm of speech, there's so much disagreement that it's easy for nothing to happen. I think if you come into the realm of design, there are things that we can agree upon. There's a reason why like privacy controls get into legislation, because everyone can agree on that. I think everyone could agree that we don't want them to optimize for these like simple forms of engagement. And so I think there are some number of things that we can start to all agree upon. And I think it is that level of convergence that conversations like this can drive that may actually lead to meaningful change.
So design as a more promising area for consensus than speech.
Yes.
Well, the building code standard setting idea is one, right? So I think across a variety of areas, there's not one single answer. Can you drive market pressure in a certain direction? And then, I think there's always government regulation. I mean, they're holding out the idea of some forms of government regulation, either to induce change by companies on their own. And so you'd ask me the question about the middleware idea. It's possible that either through an antitrust intervention or through FTC or through legislation of one form or another, that you could have a friction by design regulation that focused on creating a governance scheme specifically to enable middleware options. so I think there's a full range of possibilities. I think that what we need to know more about is what are the relevant kinds of interventions, how do they work? We have to do more systematic interdisciplinary study where we can put together a range of proposals about what might work in different areas so that we can actually learn what they're like both in the lab but also out in reality and in practice. So
as an Italian, can I give a shout out to the Italian privacy regulator who actually banned ChatGPT for a while, and now ChatGPT has an incognito mode. So there are ways of pressuring from also regulators. So I think that is definitely something that will work.
I think we've been geographically distributed on this table because as a French, I also tend to think that the governments once in a while should get involved and yell at everybody. But that's perhaps our European perspectives on this matter. There is a question that's interesting and provocative, which is, you've all talked about how to handle design changes for those poor negative impact of amplification. What about the design intervention that says just no algorithm? Platforms without amplifications, without algorithm. Maybe this means that we sort of skipped a beat in discussing why we are trying to manage this problem and sort of what comes with the benefits of amplification, algorithmic curation. Any of you want to comment on why we're trying to fix it rather than why we're trying to scrap it?
So one of the things I said, we were talking in in between earlier sessions about was how we've all taken as a given that we're optimizing for or that platforms are optimizing for engagement. And yet very few conversations about, well, how would you change that? How would you change the underlying optimization goal or objective? And so if you cut out ads, right? If you cut out surveillance, if you made surveillance of user behavior on platforms friction-full, really hard to do, or you made advertising to people based on personal information or in situ much harder through friction. That would potentially lead away from optimization for a narrow form of engagement and towards other. I'm just riffing off the top of my head, but that could drive things in a different direction.
And as a riff off the internet, or at least a part of the internet that's been filtered to me through this iPad is riffing alongside you and asking, what about federated spaces? Does that become easier in federated spaces? I know you're working on this. This one is for you. Does that magically disappear when we think about spaces like Mastodon and those alternatives to the social media platforms?
Yes and no is unfortunately the answer. I wish I could say yes, federation is obviously the solution. This is the future. There are a couple of challenges. There's also a couple of benefits. So let's start with the benefits, trying to be more optimistic. I think the economic model of the Fediverse does bend away from some of those perverse incentives that have characterized the first generation of social platforms. The lack of ads, the lack of really any incentive to want people to spend time on these platforms means that people use these platforms because they find value in those interactions and because they are driven by people's goals. There's also a lot more opportunity for direct control. So we're taking something from being, here's a phrase you don't hear anymore, the global village, to now saying, actually, these are small villages. Mastodon is 22,000 separate instances, each of which can be more self-sovereign and self-governing than Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. And so I think those are positive shifts. There are challenges, right? Those 22,000 villages have different rules. Some of them have rules that say white supremacy is awesome, and they become challenging for the rest of the network to deal with. Moderation is no longer something where there's one team that is an underfunded cost center of blah, 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 whatever else it was. I was traumatized by all four of those things. But you have to deal with that 22,000 times over. And that's really hard. And so you need to think about solutions to that. And that's institutions and technology, and nobody really owns the problem. But I do think federation can help with addressing some of the incentives here. I would also say I think at some point we need to focus again on what it is that users want. Right? The reason I don't advocate for scrapping algorithmic systems is that they're really useful. They are valuable to people. This came up earlier today, but the reason that recommendation systems are helpful is that people don't have infinite time, and so you want to spend your time valuably. The reason that I already know the people who are going to text me to yell at me about this one. The reason trending topics on Twitter is useful is because you want to know the thing that is happening right now. And you have a lot of negative externalities that go along with that utility, but the same could be said of cars, right? They're useful. And so we need to think about ways to live with these systems instead of imagining that there is a world without them.
Let us take the last question from the room. You have the floor.
Oh, I think that gentleman was there before me, so.
Oh. Well, maybe we can take a bundle of questions. Both of you,
Please.
fast succession. You start.
Thank you for that. Thank you. My name is Swapnil. I'm a PhD candidate at NYU. And a question I wanted to raise a little more, I think it was briefly mentioned by Brett and Yoel a little bit. You talk about cross-platform policy evaluations briefly. I wanted to ask, what are some successful models for cross-platform policy evaluations in the sense where platforms are typically incentivized to study metrics on platforms, and to my understanding, like Twitter won't care about how my interventions affected something on Facebook, even though they did. They probably, like, your misinformation labels on someone's tweets probably deranked their tweets or like led to people also thinking about their content on other platforms. And I say that having done some of this research myself and facing all of those challenges. So are there successful models that you would imagine internally work, or are there other obstacles that we haven't thought of for external researchers that you might be able to navigate internally at platforms? So just getting your thoughts on that would be helpful.
Cross-platform impact evaluation. We're going to have 1 minute to take these questions, so think about it. Last question.
Sure. I was going to ask about privacy labels. In the interest of time, I'll just say, it seems like when we're talking about children's privacy regulation or children's sort of platform regulation versus adults, one of the big differences is that there seems to be a greater consensus on what the harms are for children, right? And so I'm wondering if, do we just need to do more work on defining the harms for all of us, not just our children? And is that a sort of fruitful area?
I wish we had kids on the panel, because actually I don't think that the consensus is as big as what we think it is, but that's the conversation for another day. All right, both of these questions, we have 1 minute. Rapid thoughts. They're tough and important questions.
So yes to the question over there. Go ahead, Yoel, you can answer.
Well, that was rapid.
Yeah. I mean, let's go beyond cross-platform. Like, let's recognize that some of the harmful impacts of algorithmic systems and platforms and the bad things that people do on the internet are not just impactful across different social media services, but are impactful on humanity. And we have, going back to the theme of we lack metrics, we have horrible metrics for understanding societal impact. Within platforms, it is virtually impossible to know whether anything you are doing is effective in the real world. And the result of that is that the underfunded cost centers of Silicon Valley struggle to make the case for why companies should keep spending millions of dollars to fund the creation of things like labels on misinformation. Because are those actually making people healthier or safer or more effective in their participation in democratic society? We have no effing idea. And so I think that, that's the call for research right there. We need to be able to join up the engagement-driven metrics that exist within Silicon Valley with the impact metrics that social science is so effective at gathering in the real world.
I'm experiencing a friction and a label all at once. I am staring at a piece of paper that says stop, and that is very efficient on me. This is the end of our conversation. I am so grateful for all these wonderful audience questions, and so grateful for the four of you. I hope you all get to read these papers and engage with these ideas and arguments. Thank you for this thought-provoking conversation together this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was excellent. And thank you for persevering through jazz band practice next door. They would like to apologize. We're going to give everyone a minute to clear the stage, and then we have one more short, very cool visualization for you. It's 10 more minutes, and I promise it's worth your time. Two very talented Columbia students have been working on a visualization of virality. Sahil Patel is a graduate student at Columbia University's Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science, and Samia Manan is an undergraduate student at the Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science as well. This project builds on Arvind's essay for the Knight Institute, Understanding Social Media Recommendation Algorithms, and the visualization, like his essay, explains virality as a scientific concept and illustrates demotion's impact on online information spread. I want to thank them both for their incredible work on this project, and I want to thank Mark Hansen and Michael Krish of the Brown Institute for supervising it.
Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to our presentation today. At first, I want to say a big thank you to the Knight First Amendment Institute for organizing this wonderful event. It's truly a privilege to be here and be part of this wonderful symposium that's shedding light on the algorithms that seem to increasingly define the way we interact with the world and each other. But we don't have a lot of time here, so I think we should get started right away. We're really excited to show you what we've been working on for these past couple of weeks. All right, so I'm Samia. I am an undergraduate at Columbia. Where's Sahil? Sahil's a graduate student at Columbia. And a couple of months ago, we were given a pretty big challenge. I think if we can make one conclusion from the symposium, it's that virality is far from a simple subject. Even though it's a term we use all of the time, it's kind of deceptively familiar. But when we take all of the complex algorithms, content, types of engagement, and ways of defining virality, how do we move everything together and take this complex ecosystem into a digestible way of understanding it through visualization? Much more eloquently put, how do we visualize virality? And there were a lot of different things we had to assess before we could answer this question.
So the first question that we had to tackle was which platform do we focus on? And we're part of the Brown Institute, and Twitter is among the most popular things that journalists use, and that's kind of the plus one of why we chose Twitter. But one of the main reasons why we chose Twitter in the end was the accessible API that they provided that allowed us to get pretty much all the information that we needed to make our visualization. So search queries to look at the platform data, as well as looking at pretty much all aspects of a tweet. People who interacted with it, likes, the person, the author, everything was available for us. More on the API in a little bit, but other important aspects that we wanted to look at were the establishment. So Twitter is well established, and it's the test of time, and it has an interface that we can easily recreate in our visual. First question that we had to tackle was, what do we define virality? And we relied on Arvind on this, and we defined it as 5 times the, a content that has 5 times the engagement of the median tweet of the user. So the engagement for Twitter is number of likes, number of retweets, and number of replies. And a note on that definition for us came in when we realized that putting that user-specific definition was a little hard to decipher when looking at the whole platform, because it has almost millions of users, and we had to downsize our data set. So we put a threshold of 100,000 likes on there, and this cut down on our information that we had to visualize, as well as making the information a little more digestible. What is the data that we wanted to visualize? So we relied on the API. If you guys didn't know, they are shutting down the API in about 2 days, and everything that I will cover in the next section in this section will be pretty much useless. So when looking at the information that we wanted to look at for a viral tweet, we wanted to pretty much get a 360 view of it. So looking at exactly who it is that engaged with it, the people that authored the tweet, the information around them, as well as the time of the event. So when those engagements were made. So putting everything into context for allow us to make a better judgment on the network that we want to visualize. And really, the network itself for us was more of a journey that we wanted to give people context to. So the journey that the tweet took to rack up all those engagements and how it got those engagements in. And we all have covered this until now, but this journey is really just a bunch of network of roads and essentially a network data structure. So to make this network data structure and piece it together using just the information that the API provides us, we had to, look at the time of the event, so the nodes themselves, as well as look at the follower relationships of the people that engage with it. So piecing all that together to allow us to make edges on those events and making this little network data structure. And next question that we had to kind of wrap our heads around and kind of moving into our methodology for the illustration itself, how we want to really focus on contextualizing virality. So this was the main thing that we wanted to focus on was making sure that we keep the feed nature of Twitter intact when we visualize it. So when we talk about our viewpoints on how Twitter manipulates people's feeds, we want to make sure that we hit on how people view those tweets when they are scrolling through Twitter. So that y'all will see in a little bit on how we approach that question, but we made sure we hit on that aspect. We hit on that aspect in the first place. Also looking at the tweets themselves, we wanted to put some context around them. So looking at the categories that Twitter provides on their platform, entertainment, news, and politics, entertainment, news, and sports, and including all those information when we put that into put that contextualization in front of the users. Also, the network itself, as we've discussed, piecing together this journey and illustrating that journey to the user.
So all of those first parts that Sahil mentioned were part of the onboarding process. So to actually have context to see that network structure that Sahil was talking about, we need to make sure that people understand all of these background information about where virality comes from. And also when we're talking about the Twitter API, we cannot under-evaluate how much work and effort and genius it took for Sahil to be able to go through the API while it was falling apart every couple of weeks. So we were able to get so much wonderful data, and it's because of this man's wonderful script writing. So, all right, so let's go to the onboarding section. So like we mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that people can kind of take the familiarity they have with virality and kind of apply that to their understanding of virality through the context of this visualization. So because of that, we integrated key aspects of interacting with the social media platform into our visualization itself. So to interact with the visual, you simply scroll through it, like you'd be scrolling through your Twitter feed, looking for cat memes or whatever you're into. There's also a lot of visual nods to what a Twitter feed would look like, including having the tweets themselves on the page. And this is really helpful because we're introducing all of these new concepts and definitions of virality, including the 5 times the median engagement of a tweet, which can be a lot for somebody who's just going on a web page. So hopefully by seeing these tweets in a context in which they already understand what virality means, it can be a little helpful of a transition into the more complex things we're going to introduce to later. The second part that people are introduced to is a very important graphic, and that's sources of virality. This is an interactive stacked bar chart where we can see all of the different sources where virality comes from, and it includes a lot of surprising statistics. I know that anybody can feel like, hey, maybe you're the next one who can go viral on Twitter, but unless you have more than 1 million followers, the likelihood is actually probably pretty low. Over 1/3 of all viral tweets that we calculated actually come from people with more than 1 million followers. So what this stack bar chart does is it introduces you to all of the different categories where viral tweets come from, the different account sizes, and also how many tweets actually are viral, which may be a lot fewer than you think. It also serves as a bridge to the more complex visuals. All right, another key aspect of our visualization is the concept of choice. Now, everybody likes agency when they use social media. As we've discussed a lot, everybody's used to a world with not much friction and everything extremely personalized to them, whether it's for better or for worse. However, we wanted to emulate at least a little bit of that experience on our visualization itself. So we took the three main categories, sports, entertainment, and news, and allowed users to toggle or choose in a category that interests them. But that's not just important just for the fun of the user, it's also vital when comparing data. Different categories and tweets from different categories kind of have different behaviors and can actually be very interesting to compare and contrast. So not only can users compare tweets across time, levels of demotion, but also across category, which at least we think is pretty interesting. Now, the heart of our visualization lies in the central network that maps several different dimensions within its frame. So there's versions of it with and without demotion, but most impactfully, it shows the sheer scale of how virality reaches different individuals. So the visualization itself is kind of predicated on this illustration of a burst. And the burst is a metaphor for information propagation. For example, when you like or retweet a tweet, it gets sent to all of your followers in your feed. And that's shown by the little black dots throughout the network. Then when somebody else engages with it, that's shown as a burst. Each of the bubbles are also colored to identify their separation from the original poster. For example, the closer they are to the original poster, the more blue they are, the farther they are, they're red. So let's say I directly follow Tom Brady on this graph, I would be blue. Unfortunately, in reality, I am not blue. So I'm sorry for any Brady fans out there. So this is really interesting because you can find a lot of trends in here that we're going to discuss afterwards. And when you get to play with demotion, you can see how the sheer color size and all of these different users all fade away, showing that just with a little bit of toggling in the algorithm, it can completely change whether or not something goes viral. So there's also a few key conclusions that we've gotten through these experiments. One, as I mentioned before, it's that not every account has an equal chance of virality. And that might seem obvious at first, but it's really, really staggering when we see the statistics that, as I mentioned earlier, over 1/3 come from accounts with over 1 million followers, and I believe around 66%, or around like 2/3, come from very, very large accounts as well. I believe over around 100,000 followers. Also, we find out that direct followers are extreme and crucial drivers of the lifespan and overall virality of a tweet. You can see this if you go back to this network. In the beginning, the proportion is almost entirely blue, which is direct followers of the account. After it goes on, that's when the pinks and purples start to come in. Without having that boost from the direct followers and being able to engage with your direct network, you're not going to see the success of other tweets.
Looking at the motion itself and how we kind of approached explaining how Twitter manipulates your feeds, we found that demotion can have an extreme nonlinear relationship on how many engagements that the tweet will rack up. Looking at the categories themselves, so we looked at specifically tweets within the three news and the news, sports, and entertainment categories. We found that there are many different relationships that kind of come about from being part of certain categories. We hope to make this visualization public early next week, and we really hope that y'all will check out our visualization that we put so much effort into. I'm so sorry my voice is really bad because I had to run from 103rd Street because the one train broke down, and I had to make it here. But thank you so much for attending, and I hope y'all will check out our visual.
Thank you, everyone.